The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Riverside Community College's music building, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Students hurried past with their instrument cases and music bags, chatting about weekend plans and upcoming performances. Among them walked a young woman who seemed almost invisible in the crowd. She wore simple jeans and a faded blue sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, while other students carried expensive leather music bags and designer backpacks. She clutched a worn canvas bag that had seen better days. Her sneakers were clean but clearly old, and she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate the world without drawing attention to herself. The music theory classroom buzzed with nervous energy as students filed in for their advanced class. Professor Martinez stood at the front, shuffling through sheet music with the practiced efficiency of someone who had taught the same material for 20 years. His salt and pepper beard and thick-rimmed glasses gave him an air of scholarly authority that made even the most confident students sit up straighter. The young woman slipped into a seat in the back row, just as she had every day for the past 3 months. She pulled out a simple notebook and a pencil, the same tools she used for every class, while her classmates opened expensive tablets and pulled out fountain pens. Nobody paid her much attention, which was exactly how she preferred it. "Good morning, everyone," Professor Martinez announced, his voice carrying easily across the room. "I hope you're all prepared for what I'm about to tell you, because today we're going to discuss your final performance requirement." A collective intake of breath rippled through the classroom. Final performances at Riverside Community College were serious business. They determined not just final grades, but often influenced transfer applications to four-year universities and scholarship opportunities. The professor picked up a thick piece of sheet music from his desk, holding it up like a trophy. "This semester, you'll be performing one of the most challenging pieces in the classical piano repertoire, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The room erupted in whispers and gasps. A student in the front row raised her hand immediately. "Professor, isn't that piece usually reserved for graduate students? I mean, some professional pianists struggle with it." Professor Martinez smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's exactly the point. This is an advanced class, and I expect advanced results. You've been studying theory and technique for months now. It's time to put that knowledge to the test." Young man near the window spoke up, his voice shaky with concern. "But Professor, that concerto is nearly 40 minutes long. The technical demands alone are exactly what you should be capable of handling," the professor interrupted. "I'm not asking you to perform it with a full orchestra, of course. You'll be playing with piano accompaniment, focusing on the solo parts. But make no mistake, I expect nothing less than excellence." The student who had been sitting quietly in the back row continued taking notes, her expression unchanged. While her classmates exchanged worried glances and whispered frantically to each other, she simply wrote down the assignment details with the same calm attention she gave to every lecture. Professor Martinez continued his explanation, outlining the expectations and timeline. "You have 8 weeks to prepare. That might seem like a long time, but trust me, you'll need every day. This piece demands not just technical skill, but emotional maturity and deep musical understanding. It's not enough to hit the right notes. You need to breathe life into every phrase." A student raised her hand tentatively. "What if someone feels they're not ready for this level of challenge? Is there an alternative assignment?" The professor's expression grew stern. "There are no alternatives. This is the assignment. If you don't feel capable of meeting these standards, perhaps you should reconsider whether you belong in this program." The room fell silent. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, already imagining the hours of practice ahead. Some began calculating in their heads whether they could afford extra private lessons. Others wondered if they should drop the class entirely, but the young woman in the back row simply closed her notebook and packed her things as the class period ended. She had heard every word, absorbed every detail, but her face revealed nothing of her thoughts. As her classmates filed out in clusters, discussing their panic and making plans for practice sessions, she walked alone toward the exit, "Excuse me," called a voice behind her. She turned to see a classmate approaching, a well-dressed young man who had been sitting in the front row. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've been properly introduced." "I'm David," she nodded politely. "I'm Amy." "Amy, right? Listen, I was wondering, are you planning to attempt this Rachmaninoff piece? Because honestly, I'm terrified. My private teacher charges $150 an hour, and I'm thinking I might need to book double sessions just to have a chance." Amy considered his question for a moment. "I'll do my best with it." David laughed nervously. "You're braver than I am. I heard you play during that first week when we all had to perform simple pieces. You were good, don't get me wrong, but this is completely different territory. Have you ever tackled anything this advanced before?" "Not exactly," Amy replied honestly. "Well, if you want to form a study group or anything, let me know. Maybe we can suffer through this together." David smiled, but there was genuine worry in his eyes. Amy thanked him and continued toward the door. As she stepped into the hallway, she could hear the continued conversations of her classmates, discussions about private lessons, practice, room bookings, and whether anyone had connections to pianists who might offer coaching. The truth was, Amy had been playing piano since she was 5 years old, but her path to music had been nothing like her classmates. She had never had formal lessons, never participated in competitions, never performed in recitals. Her musical education had been pieced together from library books, online videos, and countless hours of careful listening. When she had auditioned for the music program, she had deliberately chosen simple pieces that showcased solid technique, without revealing the full extent of her abilities. She had learned early in life that standing out wasn't always advantageous, especially when you couldn't afford to back up your talent with the kind of training and opportunities that others took for granted. As she walked toward the parking lot where her old Honda waited, Amy thought about the assignment. Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto was indeed one of the most challenging pieces in the repertoire. It demanded not just technical skill, but the kind of emotional depth that came from life experience and deep musical understanding. What Professor Martinez and her classmates didn't know was that Amy had been studying this very piece for years. Not practicing it exactly, but analyzing it, memorizing it, understanding its structure and emotional content. She had listened to dozens of recordings, studied the score until she could visualize every note, and had even worked through difficult passages in her mind. During long shifts at her part-time job, the challenge wouldn't be learning the piece. The challenge would be deciding how much of her true ability to reveal when the time came to perform it. The faculty lounge at Riverside Community College smelled like old coffee and dusty sheet music. Professor Martinez sat in his usual corner chair, grading papers with red ink while classical music played softly from an old radio on the windowsill. The afternoon sun cast warm light across the worn carpet, creating a peaceful atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the conversation about to unfold. Dr. Elizabeth Thornfield pushed through the heavy wooden door, her heels clicking against the floor with purpose. As the head of the piano department, she commanded respect with her silver hair pulled into a perfect bun and her tailored blazer that never seemed to wrinkle. She had been teaching at the college for over 30 years and had seen every type of student imaginable. "Robert," she called to Professor Martinez, settling into the chair across from him, "we need to talk about your advanced theory class and this Rachmaninoff assignment." Professor Martinez looked up from his papers, adjusting his glasses. "What about it?" "I think it's exactly what these students need. A real challenge to separate the serious musicians from those just taking up space." Dr. Thornfield poured herself coffee from the pot that always seemed to be brewing in the corner. "That's exactly what concerns me. Some of these students aren't ready for that level of difficulty. Have you looked at their backgrounds, their previous experience?" "I've looked at their auditions and their work so far this semester. That should be enough." Professor Martinez set down his red pen and leaned back in his chair. "Elizabeth, we can't keep babying these students. If they want to transfer to good 4-year programs, they need to prove they can handle advanced material." "I'm not talking about babying anyone," Dr. Thornfield replied, stirring sugar into her coffee. "I'm talking about being realistic. Take that girl who sits in the back of your class? Amy something. I remember her audition. She played a simple batch piece and a basic chop and waltz. Technically sound, yes, but nothing spectacular. Now you want her to tackle one of the most demanding concertos ever written? Professor Martinez frowned, trying to recall the student. The quiet one? Dark hair, always wears that old sweater? That's the one. According to her application, she's completely self-taught. No formal lessons, no competition experience, no performance background. She works 2 jobs just to afford tuition here. Dr. Thornfield shook her head. Robert, asking her to perform. Rachmaninoff is like asking someone who learned to drive in a parking lot to compete in Formula One. The comparison made Professor Martinez chuckle, but not unkindly. Maybe that's exactly what she needs. Sometimes students surprise us when we push them beyond their comfort zones. Or sometimes we set them up for public humiliation, Dr. Thornfield countered. I've been doing this for 3 decades, and I can usually tell which students have the foundation for advanced work. This girl seems nice enough, but she's clearly out of her depth in that class. Professor Martinez picked up his coffee mug, considering his colleague's words. What do you suggest? Give her special treatment? Let her do something easier while the other students tackle the real assignment? I suggest we offer alternatives for students who need them. There's no shame in acknowledging that different students have different starting points. Dr. Thornfield pulled out a folder from her briefcase. Look, I've brought some other pieces that would still challenge her appropriately. A Mozart sonata, perhaps, or one of the more accessible Chopin etudes. Elizabeth, you know I respect your experience, but I disagree with this approach. Professor Martinez stood up and walked to the window, looking out at students crossing the campus quad. These community college students already face enough assumptions about their abilities. If we start lowering expectations based on their backgrounds, we're just reinforcing those limitations. Dr. Thornfield joined him at the window. I'm not talking about lowering expectations. I'm talking about meeting students where they are and helping them grow from there. That girl works at the campus coffee shop. Did you know that? I see her there when I grab my morning latte. She's always polite, always focused, but she looks exhausted half the time. All the more reason to challenge her properly, Professor. Martinez replied, Music should be her escape, her chance to excel regardless of her economic situation. Or it could be the thing that breaks her confidence completely. Dr. Thornfield returned to her chair, pulling out a student roster. Look, at the class makeup, Robert, half these students come from families where private music lessons cost more than some people make in a week. They've been preparing for advanced study their entire lives. Then you have students like Amy, who are trying to catch up on 20 years of missed opportunities in a few semesters. Professor Martinez remained by the window, watching a group of music students carrying instrument cases across the quad. You might be right about the preparation differences, but talent doesn't care about bank accounts. Some of my best students over the years have been the ones who had to work hardest for every opportunity. I'm not arguing against talent or hard work, Dr. Thornfield said, her voice gentler now. I'm arguing for wisdom in our teaching approach. That girl might have potential, but throwing her into the deep end with Rachmaninoff could destroy her love of music entirely. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the lounge door. A student assistant peeked in, looking nervous about disturbing the faculty. Excuse me, Dr. Thornfield? You asked me to remind you about the department meeting at 4 o'clock. Thank you, Jessica. We'll wrap up here in a few minutes. Dr. Thornfield waited for the student to leave before continuing. Robert, I have an idea. Why don't we make the final performance requirement flexible? Students can choose from a list of appropriately challenging pieces, including the Rachmaninoff for those who feel ready for it. Professor Martinez shook his head firmly. That defeats the entire purpose. The moment we give options, students will automatically choose the easier path. They'll never push themselves to grow. Some will choose easier pieces, yes, but the ones who are truly ready for advanced challenges will rise to meet them. Dr. Thornfield gathered her papers. And the students who aren't ready won't be set up for failure. I understand your concern, Elizabeth, but I've made my decision. The assignment stands as given. Professor Martinez returned to his chair and picked up his red pen again. Every student in that class will perform the Rachmaninoff, or they'll fail the course. It's that simple. Dr. Thornfield stood up, smoothing her blazer. And what happens when half the class crashes and burns in front of an audience? What happens to their confidence, their love of music, their academic futures? Then they'll learn that music at this level requires complete dedication and exceptional ability. Not everyone is cut out for it, and that's okay. Professor Martinez began marking papers again, his tone indicating the conversation was over. The ones who succeed will be truly prepared for whatever comes next. As Dr. Thornfield gathered her things, she paused at the door. I hope you're right, Robert, but I have a feeling we're going to have some very unhappy students and parents in 8 weeks. After she left, Professor Martinez continued grading in the quiet lounge, but his mind kept drifting to the student they had discussed, the quiet girl in the back row who never spoke up, never drew attention to herself. He tried to remember her audition more clearly, but it had been months ago, and dozens of students had performed that day. What he did remember was a sense of competence without flair, technique without passion. Exactly the kind of student who needed to be pushed beyond safe choices to discover what they were truly capable of achieving. He had no idea that just outside the faculty lounge, Amy had been walking past when she heard her name mentioned through the partially open door. She had stopped, not meaning to eavesdrop, but unable to move away when she realized they were discussing her abilities and her future in the program. Now she stood in the hallway, processing everything she had heard, her hands unconsciously moving as if playing invisible keys. Amy's hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the door to her small apartment. The conversation she had overheard between the professors kept replaying in her mind like a broken record. Their words stung more than she expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were so completely wrong about who she really was. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old building downtown, the kind of place where college students lived when they needed cheap rent and didn't mind thin walls or creaky floors. Amy had chosen it specifically because the previous tenant had left behind an old upright piano, and the landlord had been happy to include it in the rental agreement. Rather than pay to have it moved, she dropped her worn canvas bag by the door and looked at the piano sitting in the corner of her tiny living room. It wasn't much to look at. The wood finish was scratched and faded. Several keys stuck when you pressed them, and the middle C sharp didn't make any sound at all. But it was hers for as long as she could afford the rent, and that was more than many struggling music students could say. Amy walked to her small kitchen and put the kettle on for tea. Through the thin walls, she could hear her neighbor's television and someone practicing violin in the apartment below. The building was full of music students, which meant nobody complained about practice noises, but it also meant privacy was hard to come by. While waiting for the water to boil, she pulled out her phone and opened the voice recording app. This was how she had been studying music for years, recording herself humming melodies, tapping out rhythms, or speaking through complex harmonic progressions. It was cheaper than buying expensive software and more private than practicing on the piano where others might hear. Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2, she said quietly into the phone. First movement, opening theme in C minor. She began humming the famous melody that had made this concerto one of the most beloved pieces in classical music. Her voice was soft but precise, capturing every nuance of the romantic, sweeping theme. The kettle whistled, interrupting her recording. As she made her tea, Amy thought about the professor's conversation. Dr. Thornfield had described her audition as technically sound but nothing spectacular. That had been intentional. Amy had learned long ago that flying under the radar was often the safest strategy. When you couldn't afford to back up exceptional talent with expensive training, she carried her tea to the small desk by the window and opened her laptop. The screen was cracked in one corner, the result of a drop during her move to this apartment, but it still worked well enough for her needs. Amy opened her digital music library, a collection of recordings she had been building for over a decade. She had recordings of the Rachmaninoff concerto performed by every major pianist of the last 50 years. Vladimir Ashkenazy, Martha Argerich, Yu Zhou, Lang Lang. She had studied their interpretations, noting the subtle differences in tempo, phrasing, and emotional expression. Each recording was labeled with detailed notes about technique, style, and historical context, but Amy didn't start by listening to the recordings. Instead, she pulled out a well-worn copy of the sheet music. The pages were filled with her own pencil markings, fingering suggestions, dynamic notations, and harmonic analysis. She had been studying this score for 3 years, not because she planned to perform it, but because it was one of the masterpieces of piano literature and she wanted to understand it completely. Amy opened to the first page and began reading through the music like others might read a novel. She didn't need to hear the notes to know how they sounded. Her mind automatically translated the symbols on the page into music. Her fingers moved slightly as she read, following the fingering patterns she had worked out years ago. The opening was deceptively simple, a few soft chords that set up the famous theme. But Amy knew that those opening measures were crucial. They had to establish the mood and prepare the audience for the emotional journey that was about to unfold. Too rushed and the impact was lost. Too slow and the momentum never built properly. As she studied the score, Amy made mental notes about the technical challenges. The rapid octave passages in the development section would require perfect hand coordination. The cadenza near the end demanded not just technical skill, but the ability to shape a long, complex musical phrase without losing the listener's attention. These were the kinds of challenges that separated good pianists from great ones. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor at the campus coffee shop. "Can you cover Lisa's shift tomorrow morning?" 6 to noon, Amy quickly replied yes. She needed every work hour she could get, and morning shifts were usually slow enough that she could study between customers. That gave her an idea. Amy pulled out a small notebook and began writing down the main themes from the concerto in simplified notation. During quiet moments at work, she could mentally practice these themes, working through the fingering and expression without anyone knowing what she was doing. It was a technique she had developed years ago when she had limited access to practice pianos. She walked over to the old upright piano and sat down on the bench, which was just a regular chair she had positioned at the right height. The piano was terribly out of tune, and several keys didn't work properly, but Amy had learned to work around its limitations. She placed her hands on the keys and began playing the opening theme, transposing it to avoid the broken keys. Even with the piano's problems, something magical happened when Amy played. The music seemed to flow from her fingers with a naturalness that suggested years of study and practice. Her touch was sensitive, bringing out the melody even on the instrument's worn keys. The sound wasn't beautiful, the piano was too old and damaged for that, but the musicianship was unmistakable. Amy played through the main themes of the first movement, her muscle memory filling in the gaps where the piano couldn't produce sound. She had learned to practice this way out of necessity, but it had actually made her better at hearing the music in her mind and feeling it in her hands. Even when the physical sound wasn't perfect, her neighbor knocked on the wall, their agreed-upon signal that it was getting late for piano practice. Amy checked the time and was surprised to see it was already past 10 o'clock. She had been studying for hours without realizing it before going to bed. Amy opened her voice recording app again and began recording herself, speaking through the harmonic progression of the concerto's most challenging section. C minor to A flat major, then the modulation to E flat major through the diminished seventh chord. She whispered, careful not to disturb her neighbors. This was how she had taught herself advanced music theory, by talking through complex concepts until they became as natural as conversation. She had learned that if you could explain something clearly in simple words, you truly understood it. As she got ready for bed, Amy thought about the 8 weeks she had to prepare for the performance. Her classmates would spend those weeks frantically trying to learn notes and overcome technical obstacles. But Amy's preparation would be different. She already knew the notes, already understood the structure and harmony. Her challenge would be deciding how much of her true ability to reveal when performance day arrived. She had spent years hiding her talent, playing it safe, avoiding attention. But this assignment was different. Professor Martinez had made it clear that there would be no alternatives, no easy way out. For the first time in her life, Amy would have to choose between maintaining her carefully constructed anonymity and showing the world what she was really capable of. The old piano sat silently in the corner, its broken keys holding secrets that no one in Amy's music classes could imagine. In 8 weeks, those secrets might finally be revealed. The music building at Riverside Community College buzzed with activity during the weeks following Professor Martinez's announcement. Practice rooms that had previously sat empty were now booked solid from morning until night. Students carried thick folders of sheet music and walked the hallways with the glazed expressions of people facing an impossible task. Amy noticed the change immediately when she arrived for her usual Tuesday morning theory class. The sounds drifting from the practice rooms were different now, no longer the casual scales and simple exercises she was used to hearing, but the frustrated, repetitive attempts at complex passages that meant serious work was happening. She paused outside practice room C, where she could hear someone struggling with the opening movement of the Rachmaninoff concerto. The same 4 measures played over and over, each attempt slightly different, none of them quite right. The tempo was unsteady, the phrasing choppy, and she could practically feel the students' frustration through the thin walls. "This is impossible," came a muffled voice from inside the room. Amy recognized it as David, the well-dressed student who had spoken to her after class. "How does anyone expect us to learn this in 8 weeks?" Amy continued down the hallway, but similar sounds leaked from every occupied practice room. In room F, someone was attempting the rapid octave passages from the development section, the notes blurring together in a muddy cascade. Room H echoed with the sound of hands stumbling over the complex chord progressions in the second movement. The desperation was becoming obvious to anyone who spent time in the music building. Amy saw it in her classmates' faces during theory class, dark circles under their eyes, nervous fidgeting, and the kind of intense focus that came from panic rather than passion. During their next class meeting, Professor Martinez addressed the elephant in the room. "I know many of you are finding this assignment challenging," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "That's exactly the point. Great music demands great effort. If it were easy, everyone would be doing it." A student near the front raised her hand, tentatively. "Professor, I've been practicing 4 hours a day, and I can barely get through the first page without making mistakes. My private teacher says this piece usually takes advanced students 6 months to learn properly." "Then you'll need to practice more efficiently," Professor Martinez replied. "Quality over quantity. Focus on the difficult passages instead of playing through the easy parts over and over." Amy watched the exchange from her usual seat in the back row. She could see the frustration building in her classmates' faces, the way their shoulders tensed when the professor dismissed their concerns. She understood their struggle. Even though her own experience with the piece was so different. After class, Amy made her way to the campus coffee shop where she worked. The morning rush was just beginning, as she tied her apron around her waist, while mentally reviewing the harmonic progressions she had studied the night before. Working at the coffee shop had taught her to multitask in ways that actually helped her musical studies. "Large coffee, 2 sugars," called the first customer of the day. As Amy prepared the order, her fingers unconsciously tapped out the rhythm of the concerto's main theme on the counter. She had developed this habit over the years, practicing finger patterns and rhythms while doing other tasks, training her muscle memory even when she wasn't at a piano. The morning was unusually busy, with students loading up on caffeine before their practice sessions. Amy heard fragments of conversation that told the story of the semester's growing pressure. "I'm thinking about dropping the class," one student confided to her friend. "My parents will kill me, but I can't handle this piece. I'm failing everything else because I spend all my time in the practice room." "Maybe we should form a study group," another suggested. Pool our resources, hire a graduate student to coach us. Amy listened while working, understanding more about her classmates' situations than they realized. Many of them came from families where music lessons were a given, where private teachers and summer intensives were normal parts of growing up. But even with those advantages, they were struggling with material that demanded not just technical skill, but emotional maturity and deep musical understanding. During her lunch break, Amy decided to walk through the music building again. She needed to check the practice room schedule to see when she might be able to find some quiet time at one of the school pianos. Her own instrument at home was useful for mental practice, but there were some things that required a properly functioning keyboard. The hallways were quieter now, with most students in academic classes, but a few dedicated practice sessions were still going on. Amy passed room A, where she could hear someone working on the same passage she had heard being practiced that morning. The improvement was minimal. The student was making the same mistakes, just with more confidence. She paused outside room D when she heard something different. Someone was playing a completely different piece, a Mozart sonata, light and cheerful. It was a stark contrast to the tortured attempts at Rachmaninoff coming from the other rooms. Amy wondered if this student had decided to work on something else entirely, maybe giving up on the assigned concerto. The bulletin board outside the practice rooms was covered with sign-up sheets, and Amy noticed that the time slots were filling up weeks in advance. Students were booking rooms at 6 in the morning and 11 at night, desperate for any opportunity to practice. Some had even started sharing rooms, taking turns at the piano while their practice partners listened and offered suggestions. Amy found a pencil and quietly added her name to a few late-night slots. She preferred practicing when the building was nearly empty anyway. It gave her the privacy she needed to work without worrying about who might be listening on her way back. To the coffee shop, Amy encountered two of her classmates sitting on a bench outside the music building. They looked exhausted and defeated, their music bags at their feet like abandoned weapons. "I don't think I can do this," one was saying to the other. "I've been playing piano for 12 years, and this piece makes me feel like a complete beginner." "Maybe that's the point," her friend replied. "Maybe Professor Martinez wants us to fail. Maybe this is his way of weeding out the students who don't belong here." Amy slowed her pace, not wanting to interrupt but curious about their conversation. "I heard from someone in last year's class that he did the same thing then. Gave them an impossible assignment and then acted surprised when half the class couldn't handle it. Do you think anyone will actually be able to perform it properly?" "I doubt it. Unless someone in our class has been hiding some serious talent." Amy quickened her pace, not wanting to hear more. The irony of that last comment wasn't lost on her. Her classmates were struggling with material she had been studying for years, while their professors assumed she was the least prepared among them. Back at the coffee shop, Amy threw herself into her work with unusual intensity. She cleaned equipment that was already clean, organized supplies that were already organized, and took inventory of items that had been counted that morning. Physical activity helped her think, and she had a lot to process. The truth was becoming clear. Her classmates were drowning, and their professors were watching it happen with academic detachment. The practice rooms were full of frustrated attempts and growing desperation, while she sat in the back of class taking notes and giving no indication that she understood the music better than anyone else in the room. Amy's shift ended at 3 o'clock, giving her time to walk through the music building once more before heading home. The afternoon practice sessions were in full swing now, and the sounds were no more encouraging than they had been that morning. If anything, the repetitive nature of the mistakes suggested that some students were practicing their errors, embedding bad habits deeper with each repetition. As she walked past the practice rooms, Amy's hands moved unconsciously, her fingers working through the passages her classmates were struggling with. In her mind, she could hear how each section should sound, could feel the proper fingering and phrasing. The disconnect between what she heard in the practice rooms and what she knew the music could be was becoming harder to ignore. That evening, as Amy sat at her desk reviewing the Rachmaninoff score, she realized she was facing a decision she hadn't anticipated. Her original plan had been to perform the piece competently, but not exceptionally, maintaining her carefully constructed image as a hard-working but unremarkable student, but listening to her classmates' struggles had changed something in her perspective. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about her own academic survival. It was about the music itself, and whether anyone in the class would be able to do justice to one of the most beautiful concertos ever written. Amy was refilling the sugar dispensers at the campus coffee shop when she heard her name being called over the morning rush. She looked up to see Professor Martinez standing at the counter, his usual serious expression softened slightly by what might have been concern. "Amy, could I speak with you for a moment when you have a chance?" His voice was gentle, but there was something in his tone that made her stomach tighten with worry. "Of course, Professor. I can take a break in about 10 minutes. Amy finished her tasks quickly, her mind racing through possible reasons for this unexpected visit. In all her months in his class, Professor Martinez had never come to the coffee shop, never sought her out for individual conversation. She untied her apron and told her supervisor she'd be back shortly. Professor Martinez had found a quiet table in the corner of the shop, away from the morning crowd of students cramming for exams and faculty grabbing coffee between classes. He gestured for Amy to sit across from him, and she noticed he had 2 cups of coffee waiting. "I brought you one too," he said, pushing the extra cup toward her. "I wasn't sure how you like it, so I kept it black." "Thank you," Amy replied, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "That's perfect." Professor Martinez studied her face for a moment, as if trying to read something there. "Amy, I want to talk to you about the final performance assignment. I know it's been several weeks since I announced it, and I've been observing how the class is responding to the challenge." Amy nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had a feeling she knew where this conversation was heading. "I've noticed that while your classmates have been booking practice rooms constantly, struggling with the technical demands of the piece, you seem—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You seem unusually calm about the whole thing." Taking it seriously," Amy said quietly. "I study the music every day. I'm sure you do." Professor Martinez leaned forward slightly. "But studying and performing are very different things. This concerto isn't just technically challenging. It requires a level of musical maturity that typically takes years to develop." Amy felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I understand that. Do you?" Professor Martinez's tone wasn't unkind, but it was direct. "Amy, I've looked at your file more carefully since assigning this piece. You're completely self-taught. You work 2 jobs to afford tuition. You've never performed in a formal recital or competition. I admire your dedication to music, but I'm concerned that I may have put you in an impossible situation." The coffee shop buzzed with normal morning activity around them, but Amy felt like she was sitting in a bubble of tense silence. She had imagined this conversation happening eventually, but she hadn't expected it to feel so much like a gentle dismissal. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, though Professor Martinez pulled a folder from his briefcase. "Dr. Thornfield and I have been discussing alternative assignments for students who might need them." "Not easier assignments," he added quickly, "just different ones. More appropriate to various skill levels and backgrounds." Amy looked at the folder but didn't reach for it. "Such as? A Mozart sonata, perhaps? Or one of the more accessible Chopin pieces? Still challenging, still requiring serious preparation, but not quite so ... double quotes," he paused again. "Not quite so unforgiving as the Rachmaninoff." Something in Amy shifted at those words. The careful control she had maintained for months, the deliberate mediocrity she had cultivated, suddenly felt less like protection and more like a cage. "Professor Martinez, are you telling me I can't handle the original assignment?" "I'm telling you that there's no shame in recognizing when a challenge is beyond our current abilities." His voice was patient, almost fatherly. "Music is a lifelong journey. There's no need to attempt everything at once." Amy set down her coffee cup and looked directly at her professor. "And what if I want to attempt the Rachmaninoff anyway?" Professor Martinez seemed surprised by the question. "Well, of course that's your choice. But Amy, I want you to understand what you'd be facing. This isn't just about playing the right notes. You'd be performing in front of the entire music faculty, your classmates, their families, if you're not prepared. If I'm not prepared, I'll embarrass myself, Amy finished. Is that what you're worried about? I'm worried about setting you up for failure. Professor Martinez's concerns seemed genuine. I've seen talented students lose their confidence completely after a performance that didn't go well. Sometimes it takes years to recover from that kind of experience. Amy was quiet for a long moment, processing not just his words but the assumptions behind them. She thought about her classmates' struggles in the practice rooms, their late night cramming sessions, their growing panic as the performance date approached. She thought about her own quiet preparation, the years of study that no one knew about, the music that lived in her mind as clearly as if she were hearing it played by a world-class orchestra. Professor Martinez, she said finally, what if I told you that I've been studying this piece for 3 years? He looked puzzled. Studying it how? You said in your application that you're completely self-taught. I am self-taught. But that doesn't mean I haven't been learning. Amy felt a strange sense of freedom in finally speaking honestly about her musical background. I have recordings of every major performance of this concerto from the past 50 years. I've analyzed the harmonic structure, studied the historical context, memorized every note of the score. Professor Martinez frowned slightly, as if trying to reconcile this information with his assumptions about her abilities. That's impressive theoretical knowledge, Amy, but theoretical knowledge and performance ability are very different things. I know that. Amy's voice was steady, but there was something new in it, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. But what if theoretical knowledge isn't all I have? What do you mean? Amy realized she was at a crossroads. She could accept the alternative assignment, maintain her safe anonymity, and continue being the unremarkable student everyone expected her to be. Or she could take a leap that would change everything. Professor Martinez, I appreciate your concern. I really do. But I'd like to perform the Rachmaninoff as originally assigned. He studied her face carefully. Amy, are you certain about this? Once you commit to this path, there's no going back. The performance is in 2 weeks. I'm certain. Professor Martinez gathered his papers and stood up slowly. All right, then. But I want you to understand that I can't give you any special consideration during the performance. You'll be held to the same standards as everyone else. I wouldn't want it any other way. As he prepared to leave, Professor Martinez paused. Amy, can I ask you something? Why haven't you been using the practice rooms? Your classmates have been booking them constantly, but I've never seen your name on the sign-up sheets. Amy felt a small smile tug at the corner of her mouth. I prefer to practice at home. On what instrument? According to your housing information, you live in a small apartment downtown. I have a piano, Amy said simply. It wasn't exactly a lie. She did have a piano, even if it was missing several keys and hadn't been tuned in years. Professor Martinez nodded slowly, though he still looked puzzled. Well, I hope you know what you're doing. 2 weeks isn't much time to prepare for a public performance of this caliber. After he left, Amy sat alone at the table for a few minutes before returning to work. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from nerves, but from the adrenaline of having finally spoken up for herself. She had just committed to revealing abilities she had kept hidden for years, in front of an audience that included people who had already written her off. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and racing thoughts. She had 2 weeks to decide not just how to perform the Rachmaninoff, but how much of her true self to reveal in the process. Her classmates would be expecting her to struggle, possibly to fail completely. Her professors would be watching for confirmation of their assumptions about her limitations, but Amy knew something they didn't know. She wasn't going to struggle with the notes or the technical demands of the piece. Her challenge would be much more complex, deciding whether to perform competently enough to pass the class, or to play the music the way she had always heard it in her mind, with all the passion and understanding she had developed over years. of solitary study. As she wiped down tables and restocked supplies, Amy's fingers unconsciously moved through the fingering patterns of the concerto's most challenging passages. In 2 weeks, those same fingers would touch the keys of the college's concert grand piano, and everyone who had underestimated her would finally understand what she was truly capable of. The question was she ready for that kind of revelation? The evening of the final recital arrived with an unseasonable chill in the air. Amy stood outside the music building, watching through the tall windows as people filed into the small concert hall. Students carried flowers for their classmates. Parents adjusted their formal clothes, and faculty members greeted each other with the polite smiles that came with academic events. Amy wore the only formal dress she owned, a simple black dress she had bought at a thrift store 2 years ago, for a job interview. It was plain but elegant in its simplicity, and she had paired it with the black flats that served as her work shoes at the coffee shop. She had no family to bring flowers or take pictures, no expensive jewelry to mark the occasion as special. But as she watched the gathering crowd, she felt a strange sense of calm settling over her inside the concert hall. The college's beautiful grand piano sat center stage under warm lights. Amy had only seen it from a distance before. Students at her level typically practiced on the older upright pianos in the practice rooms. This instrument was reserved for special performances and visiting artists. Its polished black surface reflected the lights like a mirror, and even from outside the building, Amy could sense its perfect tuning and responsive touch. She checked her phone one last time before heading inside. No messages, no good luck wishes, no family checking in. It was exactly what she had expected, but somehow it felt right. This performance would be entirely her own, no external pressure, no one else's expectations to carry. Just her, the music, and the truth she was finally ready to share. The lobby buzzed with nervous energy. Amy's classmates clustered together with their families, some looking confident, others clearly fighting panic. She spotted David near the reception table, adjusting his bow tie for the 3rd time, while his parents spoke with Professor Martinez. His expensive tuxedo and perfectly styled hair made him look ready for Carnegie Hall, but Amy could see the tension in his shoulders. "Amy!" called a familiar voice. She turned to see Jessica, one of her classmates from the back row. "I can't believe we're actually doing this. Are you nervous?" "A little," Amy replied honestly. She was nervous, but not for the reasons Jessica probably expected. "I practiced until midnight last night," Jessica continued, her voice shaky with anxiety. "I still can't get through the development section without stumbling. Professor Martinez is going to be so disappointed in our class." Amy nodded sympathetically. She had heard Jessica practicing in the music building over the past weeks, struggling with passages that Amy had mastered years ago. "You'll do fine. Just focus on the music you love about the piece." Jessica laughed nervously. "What I love about it? Right now, I mostly love that it'll be over in a few hours." The lobby lights dimmed slightly, signaling that the performance was about to begin. Family members and students began moving toward the auditorium doors. Amy followed the crowd, finding herself naturally gravitating toward the back of the hall, where she always felt most comfortable. The concert hall was smaller than a professional venue, but perfectly designed for student performances. About 150 seats filled gradually with an audience that included music faculty, family members, and a few other students who had come to support their classmates. The stage was simple but elegant, with the grand piano positioned so that both the performer and the keys would be visible to the audience. Professor Martinez took the stage first, looking formal in his dark suit and university tie. "Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Advanced Music Theory final recital. Tonight you'll hear our students perform one of the most challenging and beautiful pieces in the piano repertoire, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. A murmur went through the audience. Even non-musicians in the crowd seemed to recognize that this was an ambitious undertaking for community college students. Each student has worked diligently this semester to master not just the technical demands of this piece, but its emotional depth and artistic complexity. I know you'll be impressed by their dedication and growth." Amy noticed that Professor Martinez's eyes swept the audience but didn't quite meet hers. She wondered if he was still concerned about her upcoming performance, still expecting the failure he had tried to prevent during their coffee shop conversation 2 weeks earlier. Dr. Thornfield appeared at the side of the stage with a program in her hand. "Our first performer this evening is David Richardson, who will be playing the first movement." David walked to the piano with confident steps, but Amy could see his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the bench. He had dressed for success, but his nervousness was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. He sat down, placed his hands on the keys, and began. The opening was tentative, lacking the bold confidence that the piece demanded. David's technique was solid, clearly the result of years of expensive lessons, but the music felt careful rather than passionate. He made it through the famous opening theme without major errors, but Amy could hear the places where he simplified difficult passages or avoided risks that might lead to mistakes. When David finished, the audience applauded warmly. His parents beamed with pride, and Professor Martinez nodded approvingly. It had been a competent performance, exactly what everyone had expected from a well-prepared student. 3 more students performed over the next hour. Each brought their own interpretation to the music, and each revealed the limits of what 8 weeks of preparation could accomplish with such demanding material. There were memory slips, technical stumbles, and moments where the music lost its flow entirely. But there were also beautiful passages, moments where individual students connected with the emotional heart of the piece. Amy watched and listened with growing awareness of what she was about to do. Her classmates were performing at the edge of their abilities, pushing themselves as far as their training and experience would take them. They were doing their best with material that was genuinely beyond their current level, and there was something admirable about their determination. But Amy was about to perform the same piece from a completely different starting point, where her classmates had spent 8 weeks learning notes and fighting technical challenges. She would be drawing on years of study and natural ability that none of them suspected she possessed. "Our final performer this evening," Dr. Thornfield announced, "is Amy Chun, who will be performing the complete first movement." Amy felt the shift in the audience's attention as her name was called. She had been listed last on the program, and by now, word had probably spread among her classmates about the quiet girl who worked at the coffee shop and never spoke up in class. She could practically feel their curiosity and, in some cases, their concern about what they were about to witness. She walked toward the stage. Amy caught sight of Professor Martinez in the front row. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension around his eyes. He was prepared for disaster, ready to step in if necessary to minimize any embarrassment. The grand piano looked even more magnificent up close. Its keys were perfectly balanced, responsive to the slightest touch. Amy had dreamed of playing an instrument like this for years, but she had never imagined it would happen under these circumstances, with an audience that expected so little of her. She adjusted the bench with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she needed. Even though she had never sat at this particular piano before, her movements were calm and deliberate, without the nervous energy that had characterized her classmates' preparations. Amy placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. In a few moments, everyone in this room would understand that they had been completely wrong about who she was and what she was capable of. The quiet girl from the back row was about to disappear forever, replaced by someone none of them had ever imagined existed. The concert hall fell completely silent. Even the small sounds of programs rustling and chairs creaking stopped as the audience sensed that something important was about to happen. Amy felt the weight of their attention, the power of the moment when truth was finally ready to be revealed. She looked out at the audience one last time, seeing Professor Martinez's worried face, Dr. Thornfield's polite expectation, and her classmates' mixture of curiosity and sympathy. In a few seconds, all of that would change forever. Amy turned her attention to the music, to the piece she had lived with in her mind for 3 years, and began to play. Amy's fingers touched the keys, and the first chord rang out with a clarity that seemed to stop time itself. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the concert hall with a richness and depth that no one had expected. Where her classmates had approached these same notes with careful technique, Amy played them with the confidence of someone who had been having a conversation with this music for years. The famous opening theme began to unfold, and something magical happened in the audience. Conversations that had been quietly continuing during the previous performances stopped mid-sentence. Programs that had been rustling in nervous hands became perfectly still. Even the faculty members, who had been politely attentive during the earlier performances, sat forward in their chairs with expressions of growing amazement. Professor Martinez felt his mouth fall open slightly. The sound coming from the piano was nothing like what he had heard during Amy's audition months ago. This wasn't just technically correct playing, this was artistry. The melody sang with emotional depth that typically took decades to develop, and the accompanying harmonies were voiced with the kind of subtle sophistication that revealed deep musical understanding. In the third row, Dr. Thornfield removed her glasses and cleaned them repeatedly, as if she couldn't trust what she was seeing and hearing. She had been teaching piano for 30 years and had heard this concerto performed by hundreds of students. What was happening on stage right now was not student-level playing. This was the kind of performance she might expect from a graduate student at a major conservatory, or even a young professional pianist. Amy continued through the opening section, her hands moving across the keys with fluid grace. The technical passages that had given her classmates so much trouble seemed to flow from her fingers as naturally as speaking. But more impressive than her technique was her musical interpretation. She shaped each phrase with the kind of emotional intelligence that suggested she understood not just the notes on the page, but the story the composer was trying to tell. David, who had performed earlier that evening, sat in the audience with his mouth hanging open. He had spent 8 weeks fighting with this music, hiring expensive tutors, practicing until his fingers ached. Yet here was the quiet girl from the back of class, playing the same piece as if it were part of her natural language. The difference between his careful, studied performance and what he was hearing now was like the difference between reading words from a book and hearing a master storyteller bring those words to life. As Amy moved into the development section of the movement, the complexity of the music increased dramatically. This was where most of her classmates had struggled most, where the technical demands combined with intricate musical architecture to create passages that seemed almost impossible to navigate smoothly. Amy played through these sections with apparent ease, but more than that, she made them sound inevitable, as if every note led logically and emotionally to the next. The rapid octave passages that had defeated so many students flowed from Amy's hands like water. Her technique was flawless, but it was technique in service of music rather than technique for its own sake. She wasn't showing off or trying to impress anyone. She was simply telling the story that Rachmaninoff had written into these notes over a century ago. In the front row, Professor Martinez was having a profound realization about his own assumptions and biases. He had looked at Amy's modest clothing, her quiet demeanor, her self-taught background, and had concluded that she lacked the preparation for advanced musical study. He had been so wrong that he felt a flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. This young woman hadn't just learned the notes of this concerto, she had absorbed its essence in a way that most of his students never achieved. The audience was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Parents who had come to politely applaud their children's efforts found themselves leaning forward, completely absorbed in the music. Other students in the music program who had slipped into the back of the hall to listen exchanged glances of amazement. Word was already beginning to spread through the small audience. This wasn't just a student recital anymore. This was a genuine musical event. Amy reached the cadenza, the section where the orchestra traditionally stops and the solo pianist plays alone. This was the most challenging part of the entire concerto, a passage that demanded not just technical brilliance but the ability to sustain musical interest without any accompaniment. Many professional pianists considered this cadenza one of the most difficult in the standard repertoire. Amy played it as if she were having an intimate conversation with an old friend. Her hands danced across the keys, creating cascades of sound that seemed to spiral upward into the concert hall ceiling. The music was virtuosic but never flashy, challenging but always musical. She shaped the long melodic lines with the kind of breath control that singers spend years developing, making the piano sing in ways that seemed almost impossible. As the cadenza built toward its climax, Amy allowed herself to reveal just how deeply she understood this music. Every ornament was placed with perfect timing, every dynamic change served the emotional arc of the passage. She played with the kind of freedom that came only from complete technical mastery, combined with profound musical insight. The final section of the movement approached, where the main themes return transformed by everything that has come before. Amy played these familiar melodies with new emotional weight, as if the journey through the development and cadenza had changed their meaning. The music that had begun with romantic yearning now carried notes of triumph and resolution. Dr. Thornfield found herself thinking about all the assumptions she and her colleague had made about this student. They had seen her quiet demeanor and modest circumstances and had concluded that she lacked the background for serious musical study. They had offered her an easier assignment, worried about her ability to handle the challenge of the Rachmaninoff. Now, listening to this performance, she realized they had been spectacularly wrong about who Amy really was. As Amy approached the final pages of the movement, the music built toward its magnificent conclusion. The technical demands were at their highest here, with rapid scales and powerful chords that required both strength and precision. Amy played through these passages with unwavering confidence, building the excitement and energy that would bring the movement to its triumphant close. The final chord rang out across the concert hall with perfect clarity and power. For a moment, absolute silence filled the space, not the awkward silence of confusion, but the profound quiet that follows a deeply moving musical experience. The audience seemed to be holding its breath, processing what they had just heard. Then, as if released from a spell, the applause began. It started with a few isolated claps, but quickly grew into something much more substantial. People weren't just being polite. They were responding to music that had genuinely moved them. Parents who had never heard classical music played at this level applauded with real enthusiasm. Faculty members who had heard hundreds of student performances clapped with the kind of respect reserved for truly exceptional artistry. Amy stood and bowed simply, her expression calm and gracious. She didn't seem surprised by the quality of her own performance. This was clearly not an accident or a lucky moment, but the natural result of years of preparation and genuine musical gift. As she walked off the stage, the applause continued, and voices in the audience began to buzz with excited conversation. Professor Martinez sat in his chair, still processing what he had just witnessed. He had expected disaster, had prepared himself to offer gentle encouragement after an embarrassing failure. Instead, he had just heard one of the finest student performances of his teaching career. The quiet girl from the back row had just revealed herself to be something none of them had imagined, a true musician with talent that belonged on professional stages, not in community college recital halls. As Amy disappeared into the wings, questions began to form in everyone's minds. Who was this student really? How had she developed such extraordinary abilities while working 2 jobs and studying in a community college program? And most importantly, what other assumptions had they all made that were just as spectacularly wrong? Amy walked off the stage to continued applause, but as she reached the wings, she could hear Professor Martinez's voice calling her name. The applause was still going strong, unusual for a student recital, and she realized they wanted her to return to the stage. She walked back out and bowed again, this time allowing herself a small smile. The audience was on their feet now, not just polite appreciation, but genuine enthusiasm. In the front row, she could see Professor Martinez clapping with an expression of complete bewilderment, while Dr. Thornfield sat shaking her head in amazement. As the applause finally died down, Professor Martinez stepped onto the stage. His usual composed demeanor had been replaced by something Amy had never seen before, a mixture of awe and embarrassment that suggested he was still processing what had just happened. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, his voice slightly unsteady, "I think we can all agree that what we just heard was truly exceptional." He turned to Amy, who stood quietly beside him. "Amy, I have to ask, and I think I speak for everyone here, how did you develop such extraordinary abilities?" Amy looked out at the audience, seeing faces filled with curiosity and amazement. Her classmates sat with expressions ranging from shock to something that might have been respect. David, who had performed earlier, was staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. "I've been studying music for a long time," Amy said simply, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "But according to your application, you're completely self-taught?" Professor Martinez pressed gently. "No formal lessons, no conservatory training. How do you explain what we just heard?" Amy took a breath, realizing that her days of hiding in the background were officially over. "Music has been my life since I was very young. I learned differently than most people, but I never stopped learning." Dr. Thornfield had joined them on stage now, her curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. "Amy, that performance showed understanding that typically takes decades to develop. Can you tell us more about your background?" For the first time that evening, Amy looked uncertain. She had spent years carefully controlling how much of her story she revealed, always keeping her past vague and her abilities hidden. But standing on this stage, after revealing her musical abilities so completely, she realized there was no point in half-truths anymore. "I started playing piano when I was 5, she began, her voice growing stronger. "My grandmother had an old, upright piano in her house, and I was drawn to it from the first time I heard her play simple melodies." The audience listened with complete attention, sensing that they were about to hear something important. "My grandmother wasn't a trained musician, but she taught me what she could. When I was 7, a neighbor heard me playing and said I had unusual ability. She offered to give me lessons for free." Amy paused, remembering. Mrs. Patterson was a retired piano teacher, and she became the closest thing to a formal instructor I ever had. Professor Martinez nodded encouragingly. "How long did you study with her?" "Until I was 12. Amy's voice grew quieter. "That's when my parents died in a car accident, and I went to live with my grandmother full-time. Mrs. Patterson moved away to live with her own family, and we lost touch." A sympathetic murmur went through the audience. Amy's classmates were beginning to understand that the quiet girl they thought they knew had been carrying a much heavier story than anyone had realized. "From that point on, I was truly self-taught," Amy continued. "But I had developed enough foundation that I could continue learning on my own. I spent hours at the public library, reading about music theory and history. I listened to recordings obsessively, studying how different pianists interpreted the same pieces." Dr. Thornfield looked fascinated. "What about practice time?" "Access to instruments? That was always the biggest challenge." Amy smiled slightly. "My grandmother's piano was old and several keys didn't work, but it was what I had. I learned to transpose pieces to avoid the broken keys, and I developed the ability to practice mentally when I couldn't make sound." "Mental practice?" Professor Martinez asked. "I would study scores for hours, playing the music in my mind until I could hear every note clearly. I practiced fingering patterns on tables, kitchen counters, anywhere I could move my hands." Demonstrated briefly, her fingers moving through a complex passage on an imaginary keyboard. "By the time I got to an actual piano, my hands already knew what to do." The audience watched in amazement as her fingers danced through the air, clearly, following the muscle memory of years of invisible practice. "When I was 16, I got a job cleaning the local church in exchange for practice time on their piano," Amy continued. 2 hours every evening after the building was empty. That's where I really developed my technique on a properly functioning instrument." David raised his hand from the audience. "Amy, when you auditioned for this program, why didn't you show what you could really do?" Amy looked at him thoughtfully. "Because I learned early that being exceptional without being able to afford the training to match it can cause more problems than it solves." Teachers make assumptions about what kind of support you need, what opportunities you're ready for. Sometimes it's easier to be underestimated. Professor Martinez looked uncomfortable. Amy, I owe you an enormous apology. When I offered you an alternative assignment 2 weeks ago, you were trying to protect me, Amy interrupted gently. I understand that. And honestly, part of me was tempted to take the easier path. It would have been safer. What changed your mind? Dr. Thornfield asked. Amy was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. I realized that hiding my abilities wasn't protecting me anymore. It was limiting me. And more than that, I realized that this music deserved to be played by someone who truly understood it, not just someone going through the motions. She looked out at her classmates, many of whom were still staring at her with amazement. I heard all of you struggling in the practice rooms over the past weeks. I know how hard you worked, and I respect that effort. But I also knew that I had something to offer this piece that I hadn't been sharing. Professor Martinez shook his head slowly. Amy, what you just performed wasn't student-level playing. That was professional quality artistry. Have you considered applying to major conservatories? With what money? Amy asked, but without bitterness. And what recommendation letters? I've spent years flying under the radar. Most teachers don't even know what I'm capable of. Dr. Thornfield stepped forward with sudden determination. That's going to change, starting right now. Amy, I'd like to work with you to put together applications for transfer scholarships. What you have is too rare and too valuable to waste. I'd like to help with that as well, Professor Martinez added, his voice earnest. I know faculty at several excellent programs who need to hear you play. Amy looked overwhelmed by the sudden attention and offers of help. For someone who had spent years carefully managing expectations, the prospect of people actively trying to advance her career was both exciting and terrifying. I don't know what to say, she admitted. Say yes, called out someone from the audience. Amy looked and saw it was Jessica, her classmate who had been so nervous before the performance. Amy, what you just did was incredible. Don't you dare hide that talent anymore. The audience murmured agreement, and Amy felt something shift inside her. The careful anonymity she had maintained for so long was gone forever, replaced by something she had never expected, a community of people who wanted to see her succeed. Okay, she said simply, yes. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Amy found herself surrounded by classmates, faculty, and parents who wanted to congratulate her and ask questions about her background. For the first time in her life, she was the center of attention for her musical abilities, and surprisingly, it felt right. Professor Martinez approached her as the crowd thinned. Amy, I learned something important tonight about my own assumptions and biases. I'm grateful for that lesson, even though I'm embarrassed it took so long to learn it. Amy smiled. We all make assumptions based on what we can see. The difference is being willing to change them when new information comes along. As she finally left the concert hall that night, Amy realized that everything had changed. The quiet girl who had walked into the music building that evening no longer existed. In her place was someone ready to claim her true abilities and see where they might lead. The Rachmaninoff Concerto had done exactly what Professor Martinez had intended. It had revealed who among his students had the talent and dedication for serious musical study. He just hadn't expected the answer to come from the most unlikely source of all.